Hello, I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE. This podcast is brought to you by RANE Worldview, the premier digital publication for objective geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Find out how RANE can help you stay ahead of global events at ranenetwork.com.
Welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. I'm Ryan Bull, in for Emily Donahue this week. Here with me today is Emily Hawthorne, our senior Middle East and North Africa analyst, here to talk about Iraq's government formation process. Thanks for joining me, Emily.
Thank you, Ryan.
So let's start with the background. What is going on with the Iraqi government at the moment?
Yeah, so right now there is a standoff between some rival Shia majority camps in the Iraqi parliament, in the Iraqi political system. This standoff is preventing government formation, and it's really underscoring the inefficiencies of how the Iraqi government system is structured. I think this has really come into focus in the mainstream news because over a recent weekend, followers of the Shia leader Muqtada Sadr breached Baghdad's Green Zone barricades twice, and they sort of set up camp in parliament. They were doing a sit-in. They're demanding new elections. They're demanding wholesale political reforms. And their rivals, this other major camp, it's known as the Shia Coordination Framework, many of which the groups under that umbrella are more sort of Iran-leaning, pro-Iran. They held competing protests, and they have asked the followers of Muqtada Sadr to stand down. The big sort of takeaway from this is it's really these two major groups that are preventing the formation of a government really 10 months after we just had these elections in October 2021. And it's preventing a lot of Baghdad's ability to really rule on anything or make policy on anything.
So what's different this time? We've obviously seen political chaos in Iraq's most recent history. So what's different this time from some of the previous political chaos we've seen?
Yeah, I think there are two main differences. One, this is one of the longest times that we've gone between election to government formation. And, as I was just sort of getting to, that just prevents a plain and simple problem in terms of political continuity, business continuity, economic issues. There's just an issue when you don't have a strong government sort of in power ruling over a country. There is a caretaker government in place, of course. The caretaker prime minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, has called for a national dialogue process to try and ease the impasse, but he's not really able to exert the kind of influence that he would if we had a sort of settling in this dispute between these two big rival camps. So I think that's one thing that's different, is just it's been a really long time since those elections. And we're coming up on potentially a year of this rival impasse and this these attempts between these two rival camps to try and come up with different permutations for how to form a government, and they just continue to fail, really due to the rivalry between these two groups. And that gets to the second reason, the second thing that I think is different about this time, and it gets to sort of the heart of the rivalry between these groups and why they're so opposed to each other right now. I think this is a real testing moment for how Iraqis want to be governed, how the Iraqi elite think Iraq should be governed. The main question is about whether there should be a majority government in place or whether there should be a consensus government in place. And I can just break that down a little bit. The followers of Muqtada Sadr and Sadr himself, they've been pushing for a majority government. And that's because they won the most seats in that October 2021 election. And they want to be able to exert the most influence and control in the parliament, and sort of see that reflected in policy. They think that that's a way for Parliament to be more accountable to what people actually want, because it would be reflecting what actually kind of came out in the majority vote. However, consensus government, which is what the Shia Coordination Framework wants, is really how Iraq has been governed since the in this post-Saddam period since 2003. And it's intimately linked with this system called the Muhassasa Taifiyya, or the sectarian quota system, that, sort of informally and formally grants different positions of power to different sects in the Iraqi government. And the idea is that everyone is represented to some extent. Everyone gets some government financial spoils. And there has been an argument that this sort of helps keep the peace in Iraq by giving everyone a bit of the proverbial government pie. But really for the first time, Sadr has been trying to push really hard for this majority government. There have been other non-Sadr voices, civil society activists that are more secular, non-Shia Iraqi leaders and activists who have been pushing for majority government, of course. But this, I think, was like a real testing moment for whether that could actually happen. And the reality is, just with the way that the sort of rules of the Iraqi system it is really hard to get to sort of the next stage in the government formation process if the basic sort of blocks in parliament can't come to an agreement on some of the very first steps. In this case, it was agreeing on who would be president, and that requires a 2/3 vote, and that's kind of where all the talks have fallen apart. So those are the two reasons why I think this is different this time around.
So that's some of the internal dynamics. What does this mean going forward for both Iraq as well as the rest of the region?
Yeah, it's a good question because Iraq is one of those countries, and you and I have talked about this a lot, Ryan. Iraq's one of those countries in the region that it has seen a lot of external regional powers try, in some cases successfully, in some cases not as successfully, but try to exert their own influence on Iraq's internal affairs. Iran is a major one, and Iran does have a lot of influence within one of these rival groups, the Shia Coordination Framework. As I mentioned, there are a lot of sort of pro-Iran or Iran-leaning groups, political parties, militias that sort of fall under that umbrella. So one thing that we could see happen is external intervention by Iran to try and sort of ease this impasse. Sort of perhaps Iranian leaders might quietly try and convince the leaders of the Shia Coordination Framework to change their demands or reduce their demands or adjust something so that Iraq is able to form a government. So that's one thing that we could see happen, and it sort of reflects how Iraq does have these links to countries like Iran. And I think how that plays out, and if we do see that, it'll be really indicative of how Iraqi stability matters to countries like Iran for just a number of economic and security reasons, and also geographic reasons. Iraq being immediately adjacent to Iran, and Iraq's security situation having potential sort of spillover effects to Iran. And also the government in Baghdad being a place where Iran does want to maintain a foothold. Having some sort of control within that government enables Iran to sort of push against Western influence in Baghdad, as well as Turkish influence in Baghdad. That's another country that has sort of a small stake in whatever happens in Iraq. So that's one thing I think that we should be thinking about moving forward. Another thing that's very simple and straightforward is that there is a high likelihood of unrest, demonstrations, protests, and with it there is that risk of violence. One of Muqtada Sadr's calling cards is his ability to sort of galvanize followers in the street. He has a lot of constituents, followers, people that support him. The worst case scenario for Iraq, and then also for countries outside of Iraq that care about Iraqi stability, would of course be an outright violent conflict between these two camps. That's not unheard of. It's not our most likely scenario at this point, but it's not, unheard of. And then, another sort of thing I think that we should watch is just how this situation unfolds in terms of any actual sort of reforms for the political system in Iraq. As I mentioned, the situation is sort of unveiling and sort of revealing in this glaring way some of the inefficiencies and, inconsistencies in the post-2003 Iraqi system. There are ways that the Iraqi system does not serve Iraqis, and they want to change that. And even Iraqis who aren't, followers of Sadr or supporters of the Shia coordination framework, they might agree with one or the other camp on sort of what they want to do in terms of reform to the system, changes to the system. And I think because in so many ways the Iraqi system, since Saddam's, downfall in 2003, since the US coalition invasion at that time, it still is quite new in a way and quite recent, this system. And I think it still is sort of being reformed and changed and rehashed. And I think that it behooves any sort of country that had any sort of involvement in that 2003 invasion of Iraq to see what happens with this system in Iraq, what happens as sort of the inconsistencies within the Iraqi constitution are dealt with moving forward.
Well, there's certainly a lot of moving pieces within the Iraqi system and a lot of regional implications to monitor, and we're glad that you're on the case, Emily. Sign up for the free Worldview newsletter from RANE. We'll send you regular updates on Iraqi geopolitics and how it affects the greater Middle East. Find out more at worldview.stratford.com. That's worldview.stratford.com. I'm Ryan Bohl. Thanks for listening.